This is Van Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Leah Brown, your FRSA, and you're a UK and US political commentator. I wanted to welcome you to the Van Electric Ghost podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Well, I love to talk to people from around the world. We've been doing it since 2016. We're at like 1,200 episodes, and we are a live podcaster. So it is the live kind of in the moment interview. But you're a problem solver, and you've been you're the founder and CEO of WayFinders Group, and you've also been on the Mid Atlantic podcast. You've been on BBC Radio, and you've got a white paper that we're going to bring up. From harm to healing, rebuilding the trust in Britain's publicly funded institutions. So before we get to the full story, we like to ask a couple of questions of any guest. What motivates you and why do you do what you do?
I'm really passionate about creating space for people to share what's on their mind so that they can feel seen and heard. I'm big on rebuilding trust when things get political or when egos get in the way. And part of that comes from a Christian conviction of really wanting to foster reconciliation. And part of that comes with just being obsessed with bringing about change.
So like today, like one of the things I was reading about is you like to work with, organizations that maybe have like, they've done like harm, even though they were like it was a public situation, like in the US. The Great Society had some impacts that people didn't probably think about when they created it. It kind of separated families and had so the social architecture actually did the opposite of what they were trying to do. And so sometimes I'm wondering, like in your conversation with what you're dealing with, is that what your destructive patterns that undermine organizations, is that what you're trying to talk about? Similar?
Yeah, it's patterns of investigations and cover-ups and protecting one's own reputation rather than admitting what's true and trying to figure out how to forge a better path forwards.
Yeah, so the systematic roots of like institutional harm, and then like you cover-ups and people not being willing to have daylight or the light shown on things. So, so in terms of your experience with this, what made you want to go into this type of work?
So when I talk about mediation, restorative justice is kind of the next phase of that work. So it gives, if mediation is helping people have an effective conversation, restorative conversations are about helping people address the harm that has been caused and consider what it might look like to make or experience amends. And I found that mediation was incomplete because it can be used to repair relationships, but that's not at the focus. At the focus is solving a problem. And I think those restorative processes really enable people to find healing. So, for example, if you've been traumatized by something, you tend to get trapped in that situation as if it was still happening today, even though it might have happened a long time ago. And survivors get trapped in that because they're not able to acknowledge or process what has happened to them. They're not able to understand why it's happened to them specifically. And they also haven't been given an opportunity to challenge the person that has hurt them to say, well, you admit that you've done this. What are you going to do about it? Because, and we might come on to this, but when we look at what does justice mean for a survivor, more often than not, it means that the survivor doesn't want that person to hurt somebody else in the same way that they've been hurt. And mediation doesn't deal with that, but restorative justice does.
Yeah, because a mediation might just have a settlement, and then the settlement might have a non-disclosure agreement, and then that doesn't really protect the next person.
Exactly.
So is that the kind of scenario where mediation doesn't always solve the root cause or the continuing problem?
Exactly. And you can't force somebody to make an apology. You can't force somebody to take responsibility. You can invite them to do that, but you cannot impose that in a settlement agreement, for example.
Yeah. So restorative approaches, how do they work? Like what have been successful restorative approaches that you've taken on?
Well, I think for me, I try to embed our restorative framework that we talk about in this white paper. So that is acknowledgement, an apology, accountability, and amends into my mediation work, into my conversations with leaders in all environments, partly to get people thinking about the art of the possible, partly to get people to consider what's going on for them before they jump to how to solve what they're hearing from somebody else. And part of that is because it is not natural to us in, I think, any Western society to see ourselves in the position of the perpetrator.
Oh yeah.
We naturally want to think that we are right, that we've done nothing wrong, that it's not our problem. You know, that phrase, that sounds a lot like a you problem. We're very good at externalizing and wanting to seem of a higher status or of a better version of ourselves than sometimes we actually are. And so this idea of restorative justice and restorative approaches are uncomfortable for people because suddenly they're having to see themselves possibly as an oppressor rather than as a victim. And that is very uncomfortable to people, especially when they're coming face to face with the notion of hurt people. Because at some point, the road runs out and you have to take responsibility for your behavior.
Yeah, like in the States right now, we have a kind of things going on where people are rewriting history. Like I'm part indigenous, I'm part Cherokee Blackfoot. And they want to just wipe out any history that doesn't make them feel good. Right. So if you actually have an incident, there are multiple incidents with Native Americans in the US. And they're trying to wipe them off the history books off of web pages. So that's not very that's not very, and it's across the board in multiple ethnic groups or different minorities or people who were maybe the other. And they just their solution is to, if it was something bad like like Tuskegee Airmen issue or something that happened with the Black Wall Street, nobody wants to hear about it because it makes them feel bad.
Yeah. And also, you could argue that those stories that affect the marginalized voices don't sell as well in the media.
Yeah. I mean, what people want to do is it's like, well, I just want to have the Horatio Alger myth. I just want to talk about like how I could be the next Edison, the next Henry Ford, and not talk about potentially like no one person it's just all their story that they didn't actually build from connections with other people, and sometimes one person gets all this like press that they're the only one that did it, when it's really like it was a group thing, but like the group thing is not really discussed. We're talking about, oh, it just came from one person's initiative.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think part of it is collective pride, and I think part of it is groupthink. So we talk a lot about groupthink in the UK and how that's resulted in poor decision making, because people don't want to challenge the status quo, or they don't want to stand up for what is right or true, or they're worried about the consequences if they do. And so part of this work is truth telling and being unashamed about that, even though it's harder and it's countercultural and it's not popular. But again, harm to healing, that kind of approach is harmful. And if we want to have social cohesion, we have to re-inject healing into the conversation. And that means having challenging conversations that make people feel uncomfortable. Because, if you've experienced something heinous, what isn't going to help you is if everyone around you denies your experience and pretends that didn't happen, because it's too difficult for you to conceive that it could have happened or probably did happen. And I think that does survive as a huge disservice.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people just want to talk about like suck it up or get over it, and if there's like if they're groups of powerful people or powerful interests, they'd rather just sweep it under the rug and not talk about it. And the thing a lot of times is like we have a very modern situation going on with the disruptors, the kind of technocratic disruptor. So a technocratic disruptor looks at like, like ecology laws, like the EPA, looks at civil rights laws, looks at um, copyright law. And so, well, that's actually, that's counter to my progress with all this AI. And so I rather just get rid of all that and be a disruptor, and then artist rights, creative rights, people's, respecting people's boundaries with their personal health information. That's all like, well, it's I want to be a disruptor, so that's the cool thing to do. That's the hip thing to be into. And if you mention all these other groups, it's like, well, you're just belly aching.
Yeah, and that's partly motivated by greed and the ability to create excessive wealth. I was watching David Attenborough's documentary Oceans over the weekend on the beach, and that's another good example of how David says, well, Sir David says that nobody owns the oceans, and therefore whatever people are doing in those oceans, whether that's trawling and not doing responsible fishing or destroying the coral reefs or whatever it is that's affecting the underwater ecology, is done without accountability, because who's going to police that situation?
Well, there's no cost.
Who has the right to tell me that I'm not allowed to do it, or that I'm wrong? And I think in any situation where you create that lack of accountability and let that persist for long enough, you're going to have these outcomes.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, if you think about it, a lot of the products and services that the industrial world creates did not price the damage that the product creates. So, like cigarettes, they didn't price the damage until they got sued.
Right.
Asbestos, they didn't price the damage until they got sued. Different practices, like if you're a coal-fired oil power plant, they didn't factor in the cost of that power with the damage you're doing. Crosses into Canada, crosses into other places. So Canada crosses over to us and we cross over to them. It's not priced in the price of that power. So a lot of times in capitalist structures, like we talk about it, oh, the market's going to solve it, but then you don't have things built into the price.
That's true.
And so it's kind of artificial. We're talking about the market, and now we have all these disruptors saying, "Oh, we're beyond the market." There's people
That's
talking
because they're market makers, and that is the marker of disruption when it's created a new market, or in fact, a whole new area of damage. I don't know whether you've read Careless People by Sarah, I can't remember her surname, but that talks about the leadership at Facebook and her experience working in public affairs for them globally.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is the underlying strategy and their why, to coin a Simon Sinek phrase, and how that kind of perpetual need for greater market share, greater numbers of participants overrides that sense of collective human responsibility, or the need to be in any way accountable for the negative impacts that kind of approach is having on society. For example, underage children accessing social media too early on in their development, or seeing content that is not for them.
Well, the problem is we get these monopolies. Like in the tech world, a lot of the legal aspects of regulation haven't caught up to the tech. So if you get like an Amazon, you get a Facebook, and they have behaviors that, back in the 30s, that's a monopoly. And there were laws put in place in the US to stop monopolies, but they've been weakened. And when you get into the cyberspace or to the cloud space or the internet space or the AI space, the law's not catching up with the ability of the tech to do something.
Yeah, it's the same issue with online safety. It's the same issue with many of the challenges of people who are experiencing harm through institutional decision making, because the law isn't able to. We see it here with respect to hate crimes, for example, and misogyny. And what do those terms mean? How do we legislate for those in the criminal justice system? Is it toothless regulation, or is it actually impactful? So that's a common problem everywhere, and that is a result of technology.
Yeah, because the hate crime is kind of very, like in the US, it's really strategically used in certain scenarios. So like in America, like if you're a terrorist organization, it's always outside. But if you're like a domestic terror organization, it's not really tracked as a hate crime in a lot of cases, right? So if you're, in an Aryan Nation or the KKK, that what they do is the same as Al Qaeda, same as ISIS, same as anything, but it doesn't get tracked that way.
Right. Right.
Because they purposely don't want to categorize it that way.
Right.
So then certain groups don't get the protection that, like, the group on 9/11, to get the victims fund for them.
Right.
But the victims of these other crimes, no compensation, no consideration, no acknowledgement.
That's a good example of why a restorative framework is needed.
So like what you're finding in the UK, like what are your success stories versus your challenges?
I think there are quite a few challenges, and the first is culturally, we're not ready for accountability. And part of that is because I was saying earlier today, when I was asked, what's the one thing that you would want to change if you had the power to do that about how people are responding? And I said, it'd be great if people would just say what they mean. If they could just express how they feel. It's such an indirect culture that there's no kind of inherent directness or willingness to give feedback unless it's explicitly invited. We find the whole concept of feedback really painful. Any kind of confrontation or challenge is difficult. And part of that dance is beautiful, but actually it's so counterproductive when people aren't healthy, or when people have been harmed by people who aren't healthy, because it makes it then impossible to speak truthfully about an experience or get that validation of you had a responsibility to do this, or you had a responsibility to intervene and you didn't do it. And that's one of the challenges. I think survivors are really, really clear about what's gone wrong and how to fix it, but they're either silenced or, quite frankly, they're tired of saying the same thing over and over again and just not being heard. And I think, we see lots of situations where half the work has been done. So in the UK, we've had a number of scandals. We've had the post office scandal. There was a wonderful documentary made on ITV about that. Post office and Mr. Bates. We've had the COVID inquiry. We've had the infected blood scandal. We've had grooming gangs. We've had the Grenfell Tower that burned down 8 years ago. We've had Windrush, where people have been deprived of compensation because they've been deprived of their liberty when they didn't keep records of passports or right to be in the UK. And there has been a move towards justice for those disparate groups, but this is more about how do we embed prevention in this conversation, not just, oh, look, another scandal, oh, look, another payout, oh, look, another
proactive. Like, how can you be proactive if it's like a cultural, like I was in sociology major, like a social mores of the cultural etiquette is to not really dive into those things. And if you don't dive into them, then you can't even have a conversation about preventative actions if people are so uncomfortable about even talking about the situation. So you get edited out of being even able to bring it up.
Yeah, that's right. I think we do have a high activism culture here, though. And so I think in terms of what's working well, safety in numbers. And actually, I think we're seeing this both sides of the pond, right? If you want to effect any kind of change, first of all, you can't do it alone. Second of all, you've got to start with the community, and you've got to do bottom up and top down. So you've got to work out what that looks like. But also, you've got to find people who really understand the essence of what you're trying to achieve, and don't question whether or not it's possible. are just coming on the journey, because they're also working towards that. And together, we are going to be more effective than we are individually. And so I think collaboration is working well. I think there is appetite. And I think if I had realized earlier how important it was going to be to mobilize the survivor community, I would have started with them before I started trying to work on the political side to talk about these issues. And so I think I'm always very positive about how incremental change is still change. And that's not me congratulating myself or being like, hey, look, the WayFinders group, we're amazing. That is not what I'm saying at all. But I think even baby steps towards a future where there is more acknowledgement, where things happen and there are amends made. And part of those amends is creating systemic changes that prevent that thing from happening again, that kind of collective reflection, and that sense of, unless we take a preventative step at this point after the crisis, it will continue to perpetuate the same challenges that we've had previously. And so if I can embed that from a governance perspective in even one area, again, that's change that I think should be celebrated. So, trying to work in small ways while still having a big vision is again a privilege, and taking things a day at a time. That's going well.
Do you find like, at least in the UK, are you getting a lot of pushback on, like in the US, like diversity, equity, and inclusion is on the pushback, right? Like it's being like totally written out of places. I mean, there are events being canceled, people being canceled, websites being canceled, categories being canceled, roles being canceled. Are you getting that kind of level of things going on in the UK, or you're actually not in that kind of state?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, because we're very good at performativism in the UK. And so there are a lot of organizations who have proven themselves to not actually be in support of our communities. The funding model is slightly different. Obviously, any organization that is headquartered in the US is affected, and multinationals as well, from that movement against DEI. There are a lot of organizations that are organizing themselves a little bit more quietly, I think. And there is concern and fear that the waves that have been seen in the United States will be echoed in far-right Britain, depending on how our political landscape continues to evolve. Again, I am optimistic. I do think that societies have the ability to self-correct. And I also think that, again, this collective mobilizing is what has to happen, and redrawing those boundaries of, okay, what is our shared purpose and how can we work together to overthrow a common enemy, is a helpful way of looking at things. I think in the UK, though, honestly, Britain is broken and we're incredibly distracted by that. And every day something else is creaking. It's like living in a terribly maintained Victorian, or I don't know, maybe even Georgian townhouse, and there's asbestos in the ceiling, the plaster's coming off the wall, there's wallpaper from 3 occupants ago that's papering over holes that have got
so you got a structural deficiency, like the structural deficiencies that we have in the US, because we have structurally deficient aqueducts, structurally deficient like bridges, structurally deficient dams.
We don't even have clean water.
Yeah,
we have sewage everywhere, and it makes you just think. There are so many news reports that say third world country ? And it's like, but we don't need to be. If we just invested in preventative solutions after a crisis or a scandal, we would not be in this situation. But the short-termism that has infected the minds of leaders who don't care about the legacy or blame what they have inherited on the person before them, rather than taking responsibility and saying, okay, not again on my watch.
Yeah.
It's continuing to worsen. And again, the optimist in me thinks that this can be right-sided. But it's a challenging time. And so, yes, whilst I don't in any way want to undermine the significance of the challenges relating to DEI or particularly the education sector funding, there are so many challenges facing Britain at the moment. It would almost be unfair to focus in on one.
Yeah, because it sounds like the U.S. is running into a similar problem. Like I've said, like there's multiple issues with our infrastructure that people just they worked on it 100 years ago, and then they never really kept it up, and it's just falling apart. And it's not sexy. It's not to actually go and say, well, you got to fix it. Well, that cuts into the other priorities that people have. So
Absolutely.
people have these priorities to build AI infrastructure, and then the water you need for it, right? They didn't think about that. The power you need for it, they didn't think about that. So they want to jump to a couple of steps without thinking about the foundational things because everybody's into the short term, like now.
I think it's worse than that, though, right? If we take the water companies in the UK for an example, why are we in situations where the executives are choosing to allow the shareholders to receive huge dividends? Okay, I accept some of them are pension funds, but huge dividends, and then paying out the executives millions of pounds in bonuses for failure, right? They not only they haven't delivered the bare minimum, they've also failed to deliver a public service, they've failed to generate sufficient profits, and yet still they are being paid to underdeliver. And that is increasingly the reckoning that the public is experiencing here in the UK, because they're saying, well, hang on, the reason that we're having hosepipe bans at the moment is because the water infrastructure is leaking liters of water at such an excessive rate that we're not going to be able to ensure every household has water. So hang on, you can't fill your paddling pool and you can't wash your car. And it's like, well,
the buck's supposed to stop. Like the idea, like with the CEO or the president of a company, whether it's a nonprofit or government or private, the buck's supposed to stop here. But I can see the same thing happening, like in the U.S. Like Tesla, like their shares have dropped, and Elon got a big bonus. How does he get a big bonus if you're a shareholder and his job performance for the shareholder has been terrible, right?
Yes, but don't discount the value of his time running Doge and getting policies passed so that he could shore up the future of what is coming down the track in their business plan, which is another issue of institutional harm, because I don't even know how constitutionally that is actually allowed to happen. But again,
it's another issue. We have a lot of gates that are not being paid attention to. Like the 14th Amendment, they didn't pay attention to it. The Emoluments Clause, they haven't paid attention to it. They've been picking and choosing what they pay attention to based on whoever's in office. And it's starting to give a lot of people, like the structure of our society, people don't have a lot of respect for the Supreme Court. They have no respect for Congress. And, and the respect for the presidency is divided like in half, depending on who you are, like what party you're in. So it's kind of at a really bad tipping point. Being a political science major is like we're at this point where the American empire is like crumbling. I would say it's kind of decrepit. It's falling apart, and I don't know what the future. Like you want to be positive about the things that can happen, but there's a lot of things that we were told that we were supposed to believe in that don't seem to be being backed up.
But that's the thing, isn't it? The fight that's going on at the moment is for democracy. And what does democracy really mean? And what is citizen engagement? And how are decisions made? And why is accountability for those decisions so important? But most importantly, what happens when those rules are not enforced? What happened? And so part of this is we're waiting for the passage of time to see how the courts navigate some of the challenges that the presidency has created here. In the same way, we're waiting for some of the legal challenges to come through of some of the failures that have happened here in the UK. And, the measure of the leader isn't just how they respond in the moment. It's, I want to see behavior over a period of time that shows that there is a commitment to that transformation that's needed. And again, we're back to the short-termism and the groupthink that excludes or maybe excuses the need to challenge the status quo and do things differently.
Is everything based on just winning an election cycle. Like in the US, it's gotten to a point where the election cycle is so embedded in this kind of structure that no one really cares about long-term, like what FDR did or the Great Society. Nobody's thinking about those things. They're just thinking about, I've got to maintain my power.
I think that's true here as well. I suppose the difference is you can hold political office for longer than 8 years as the majority leader if you retain the control of the House of Commons. I do think with all of the transition we've had in prime ministers over the last 10 years, yes, power is front and center. You only need to look at all of the reports coming out from the leader of the Conservatives this week about how being British as a Nigerian woman is the soundbite of the day. But last week it was something different. And I guarantee next week it'll be spinning the same thing in a different way because it's politically expedient. And we've lost the measure of a leader. I write about this a lot. And we've lost that sense of prestige and pride and national service and a real sense of the weightiness of being a public servant and servant being.
When do you think the last leader had that kind of respect in the UK? Or the last leader that had that kind of respect or that vision?
I mean, Tony Blair. In the height of his premiership, probably. I'm not saying that he's the last, but he certainly held power for the longest. And in some ways, universally liked post Thatcher, post Major. I think. I think we have a different problem than in the US. In the US, it's so hard to get above the parapet to be able to be president. Whereas in the UK, I'm not saying it's easier to be prime minister, but the fact that we've had so many suggests that there have been plenty of opportunities to exhibit. And there's certainly in the run-up to the election where Kamala Harris was the nominee, there was a question about succession and about how we should have thought about this before because we knew that this reality was coming down the track. And if it wasn't going to be her, why have we not thought about a suitable alternative?
Yeah, we don't seem to have a big pool. Like you seem to have a bigger pool of politicians who can be in that role. That we've got families like Clintons,
dynasties,
the dynasties. Like we've got people like Bushes, the Clintons. People talk, oh, let's have Michelle Obama. Everybody's like, it's only a small amount, like 10 families that you're going to pull from when you have all these other people that supposedly went to college and
which is why Obama was so surprising.
Yeah, that
right?
was a surprise.
And that comes out really clearly on Michelle Obama's memoir, right? That whole evolution of how unusual this was and the fact that he was kind of scouted and how his career rocketed. But he's not of that. Intellectually, yes, but financially, not of that ilk at all. And I think we do still have that in the UK, that kind of old money culture. But there is the difference, I think, is that in the UK, the Tories and Labour are ideologically supposed to be so different that you would expect old money on one hand and not on the other hand, right? Because one is a socialist worker party and one is, cut from the cloth of that old money. Not exclusively. There are many working class Tories. Please don't mishear me.
Yep.
But even the topic of money, and actually most importantly, the topic of class is something else that's incredibly uncomfortable in the UK, and we don't like to talk about it, but that is the root of many of the challenges.
Class issue, yeah. Well, class, when you get to it, I mean, it ends up being in a lot of societies is a root cause issue because the people sometimes don't vote their own interest. They get, like in the US, we get blue collar, they're kind of conned into not voting their interest, and they actually get the worst outcomes when they were told it was going to be a different outcome because they get manipulated.
Right.
And so so people of a certain class may have a certain understanding of like they're not going to vote against their own interest, but other people in certain classes don't get enough information or are given information on purpose so they make bad decisions.
Yeah, and we also have a lot of voter apathy here. And I think, the local elections where reform got in across the board in the UK was partly because people just didn't show up to vote. They're like, we keep voting and leaders keep failing us, so we're not going to vote anymore, even though actually it probably matters even more now than
voter apathy. So you get the apathy because if you don't, like, you get to this point where you get the disruptor and people say, well, I'm going to go with the disruptor because, like, if this somebody going to burn the whole house down because I didn't see, like, working within the system, it wasn't working. So now
Right.
we've got people going for the disruptors without really understanding that where the disruptor is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are also attracted to money, right? It's like being a light bulb and a moth coming nearby. People just want to be in the presence of perceived greatness. It doesn't even need to be actual greatness.
Yeah,
And
perceived.
that distorts things. Also, the media distorts things as well. We're seeing these fantastic debates, right, where one person sits down and then they debate 20 people who don't agree with them, and that is a fascinating move on from this incredibly polarized way of having conversations where you have these echo chambers of you only speak to people that you agree with or who share your views. So I don't know. I do remain optimistic, but I do think that we have some cultural challenges, and part of that is we are going to need to start calling a spade, or things are going to continue to get worse.
In terms of cover-ups, because that's one of your topics you like to talk about. Like, we have a lot of cover-ups supposedly. Well, it depends on what your point of view is. But either all societies can have certain levels of cover-ups. But in the UK, what are the cover-ups that you've kind of taken on?
I personally don't. I don't work in exposing cover-ups. I do spend a lot of time around investigative journalists, and I do imbibe their work product with interest, and I'm hugely supportive of media outlets that invest in and procure good quality investigative journalism. I'm more kind of objective and looking in, because where I would be involved would be, how do you have a conversation about how do you want to move forwards? Do you want to acknowledge what has happened here? Do you want to resign and fall on your sword? Do you want to stay the course? What is it that will make you look good in this situation, or what is it that will preserve your reputation in this situation, or what is it that will preserve the institution's reputation in this and how do you do that responsibly? But I think for me, I always think of Boeing. And I think it's so important to acknowledge the cost of being a whistleblower. I haven't been a whistleblower. I have done my fair share of investigations. I've investigated senior leadership in suspected embezzlement and fraud. I've investigated several senior individuals for institutional fraud. I've sexual misconduct investigations. I've had to do all kinds of things like that in my career. And you have to presume that you won't get the acknowledgement from the person who has caused the harm. You have to presume that you will not be able to convince that person of the nature of their misdemeanors. A good example of this would be Greg Wallace, who fronts MasterChef and who has recently been in hot water with the BBC. He claims that his behavior on set, which was inappropriate and of a sexual nature, was because he had autism. And how are you going to sit this person down and say, look, mate, you're the problem? Yeah. And they did not do that soon enough. They ignored it. They thought it would go away. Oh, it's just one or two people making a complaint. Oh, that's just showbiz. Oh, that's just... and the more that we kind of normalize that response, that approach, you continue to get a massive gap between the initial problem coming to light, it's resurfacing again, the cover-up, which is invariably worse than what happened the first time. And then when it finally comes out, you could be talking 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 or 30 years gap between. And in the interim, there's been no justice. So I do think that provoking that long-term thinking of, okay, let's say you do not want to say anything to preserve your own reputation. How is this story going to age? Is this going to follow you around for your entire career? What might you be able to do differently that could dramatically change the outcome of this situation? If you were the person who had been hurt by this, what would you want to happen? Really road testing and reframing those experiences to try and elicit a different response than the one that comes naturally, which is always going to be self-preservation and protection.
So the empathetic response is like not natural, I guess, for people, like to try to have that looking glass self and empathy and then put yourself in the other person's shoes. It's more like we want to salvage the franchise and anything like to keep the franchise going, keep the enterprise going, keep the keep that whole.
Well, it's like you're just a number, right? If you're an employee, okay, well, you had a problem. All right, well, we'll cut you a check. See you later. It's like the Me Too movement, right? We'll just cut you a check and you go away.
But that doesn't solve the root cause. Like if you don't get an apology, then you don't get that person out of the role and that person doesn't get stopped and they continue. It's like, well, that's just right. Cutting the check is the price of business.
But it's also, why should that person be forced out of the organization? As in the person who's been harmed, why should they not be able to keep their job? Why is it like, but it's okay, we've given you money. Yeah, but I've lost my livelihood because I'm no longer able to be in this situation because you haven't put in the necessary safeguards to enable my role in the organization to be taken more seriously. So you come back to an abuse of power and leadership dynamics kind of situation, and comes down to, how much do you value the people who work for you and around you and with you?
Well, it seems like the value, like again, like the executive of the water company you mentioned is failing and they still get the money, right? But when you're at the lower levels, your performance review means a lot, right?
Yeah.
At the lower levels, your yearly performance review, they'll get real detailed. And if you miss on the mark, then you're out or you don't get the raise. But when you get to the top floor, seems to be like flipped. They find ways to still give you high performance dollars for bad performance, even for bad behavior. Bad behavior, you got all these lawsuits against this individual, but you keep them and get rid of the worker.
I'd say the one thing that's bucked the trend, though, on that has been the latest Coldplay departures, astronomer departures, right? Where both of the individuals who are caught on the kiss cam are no longer working for the company, right? And that's quite unusual. That is the PR line and the HR line for an organization. Usually, some excuse would be made for the CEO's conduct, or the HR person would stay and the CEO would go because it would be deemed abuse of power because presumably HR reports to the CEO. But it was really interesting the way that they said, no, we have a morality clause here and we have values here, and neither of their conduct met the mark, and therefore they're both out.
Do you think that was because it was done on social media instead of being internally within the company? If that happened internally within the company instead of being like on TikTok and
YouTube. Come on. How many people who work at astronomer do you think don't know about their relationship?
Well, they probably know, but so it didn't seem like it did anything until it got to the social media.
Exactly. So the only reason that they would take such drastic measures would be to preserve the reputation of the company.
And because the social media is so
actions earlier, right?
Yeah.
But who was going to instruct those actions to be taken? The only person who could pull that lever was the person who was involved in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them. So it was like it's a classic cover-up. It's like, we're doing this, we're not supposed to be doing this, and you all know about it. It's a commonly held secret. But actually, we're not going to do anything about it because we hold the power. So who are you going to tell that we can't do this? Oh, wait, we got caught. Okay. Oh, now what do we do? Board's involved.
Because once it's outside the safety of the organization, like, you have the non-disclosure where, like, if you're inside the organization umbrella, you have all that protection. But once you start using social media, then you potentially lose that protection.
Well, I mean, in the pandemic, our health secretary got caught on camera in Downing Street with his now girlfriend, and that wasn't social media. He claims that he was set up by one of his colleagues, be that as it may. It's not just social media. It calls into question all workplace relationships and speak up culture, and how do we create a forum where everyone feels safe, everyone feels able to come to work and do their work and go home and not have these challenging encounters or this toxicity percolating and normalized indefinitely.
It always seems like HR is there and they give you all these rules and you get all this training. And I've been in Fortune 500 companies for like 30 years, right? And now I'm in a couple of startups and I'm smaller size and I like it a lot better. My concern I had when I was in the Fortune 500 companies, they tell you they have open door, you could come in and tell them something. What I experienced and what I noticed happening is if you actually did report, you got cut. You got maybe it wasn't right away, but you were limited. You got a ceiling put on you and you weren't going to advance anymore. And so then it kind of sends the message that you really can't use it. You can't use the system to report. So people just keep it in because they're like, well, if I report, it's actually going to prevent me from having any success at all.
Not truly anonymous. See, and that ability to complain anonymously is so critical to the effectiveness of that policy.
Do you think that that's the problem with a lot of corporations is they don't allow or people don't take advantage of anonymous, or they don't even let you do anonymous reporting?
I think a lot often in organizations there aren't enough personnel. So, for example, if you have a small senior leadership team, you probably don't have somebody in a different person who is the safeguarding person, the whistleblowing person, the person who can conduct the initial investigation, somebody who's more senior to do an appeal. You run out of people very quickly, which is why often organizations bring in external support, but that's incredibly expensive. I don't think it's that. I think at its root, it's a cultural problem that is rooted in fear. And there is a concern all the way up the chain in organizations like you describe. It's not just the person who wants to blow the whistle. It's the person who's investigating the round one of the complaint, who's probably received several other complaints and probably escalated it and told to, do you want to keep your job or not? Just don't say anything, or just say that we're investigating it and move on. I've seen that play out several times in my career, and it's more common than I think people would like to admit. And when you have fear baked through every level of the organization, this is a natural consequence. It's not so much whether or not the organization can trace who has submitted this complaint. It's more that if you can see these behaviors that show that fear is a driver in the way that decisions are made or the way that people are behaving, they needed to have embedded a different process to encourage people to speak up. It's why so many cultural change initiatives fail, because you think that you can just take a cookie cutter approach and say, oh, well, this worked here, so I'm just going to take that and stick that in here. And it's like, but hang on, what are you building on top of? Because actually, if there isn't that psychological safety to even question whether there is a process like this, if you surveyed most employees, no matter how much training they've been through, and said, does your organization have a whistleblowing process? Most of them will say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they say, oh, I think we might have one, well, what would be the first thing that you would do if you wanted to blow the whistle? Oh, I don't know. Well, where would you go to find that out? Oh, I don't know. Don't you have an employment handbook? Yes. Well, haven't you read it? No. Well, you signed here to say that you've read it. And that conversation, we have that a lot as lawyers. But it just shows that people don't understand in context the significance of these policies and how they play out in practice. Because quite frankly, nobody ever envisages themselves being in a situation where they would need to use them.
Yeah. And I think people just don't take it seriously when they're in their, they come into the company, they get that training. A lot of it's online, or just, it's like an SAT score, and they're just watching some video and answering the questions. And it's like, you take a course like an SAT type of thing. Like as soon as you're done, you forget everything.
Yeah.
So you don't retain it, and it's not really anything that they reinforce.
Right.
So it's not going to stay there. Like if you had a blue book exam and you really thought it out, then you're going to retain it. It's like a
Right.
Socratic method. It's like you're going to retain. It's not actually, you're not even trained in a way that it's designed to retain. It's
Right.
just going to fly out of your head. But
Yeah. I think that's right. I don't particularly like those training sessions because I like to have the stuff in front of me and, take notes and stuff like that. But they also do different ways of training people now, and some of it's really interactive. Some of it's really good, but some of it is really not very good at all.
Yeah, if you just, like, a lot of companies just plug and play, they buy some third party
Right.
HR thing, and then they just run it, and then that's what they do. And so then that you get what you get, like garbage in, garbage out. Like it's like I'm a software guy, so I like, what you put into it is what you get out of it.
But that's, again, ticking the box and saying, well, actually, we're not going to invest in a better product for our employees because we don't think this really matters.
Yeah, because you're just trying to do the bare minimum. You're just trying to get, well, how do I stay compliant? Do you really have an interest in actually pushing that forward and creating a safe workspace? Are you concerned with that, or do you just trying to be, just when the regulator comes along, did you check the box off? Yeah, I did. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what it is. But in terms of difficult conversations with people, and maybe how do you keep from like escalation or unnecessary escalation, or bad vibes, or situations you really don't want to be in, that create like maybe a bad outcome.
I have been thinking about that today. I mentioned to you before we went live that I've been doing a couple of mediations today, amongst other things. And the first answer is, you got to leave your ego at the door. And I say that as a mediator. I say that because it is very easy to insert yourself in other people's drama. It is a lot harder to be an active listener as you try and work out, not what is this person's problem, what is going on for this person, what do they need, what is important to them, what is driving their behavior. And I think you adopt curiosity as a disarming method, really. So I often find that kind of self-deprecation quite helpful. You mentioned this. I don't know very much about that. So if you could just humor me for a moment, perhaps you'd like to tell me a little bit more about insert anodyne thing here. It disrupts the flow. It shows them that you've heard them. It gives them an opportunity to feel both valued and engaged, and you've disrupted the angst. But you've also, maybe, if you're being crafty about it, focused in on something that they are railroading over because they're so angry about something else that they're not taking the time to say, well, actually, let me sit with this other feeling and explore where that's coming from, or what's going on there. There are a lot of people who work in mediation who will say that there's no such thing as a difficult person or a difficult conversation. And I don't agree with that entirely. But there is something about being able to reframe even the most difficult idea or the most uncomfortable notion into something not just positive, but something hopeful. And part of the ways that you can do that is say, I'm hearing from you that you're finding this incredibly challenging. You've expressed a lot of different emotions today. What would it feel like if you didn't have to feel any of these feelings tomorrow because we're able to deal with this today? What would it feel like to be able to go home to your wife and to never have to talk about this subject again because it's been resolved? Where do you want to be in 3 years' time? Do you want this to still be something that you're carrying around, or do you want it to be a footnote in your wider story, so insignificant that actually eventually you don't remember it at all? How can we get to that reality? Where would you like to go next? How can I help you realize that? And giving somebody agency, right? Because in a difficult conversation, why is it difficult? Because you've lost control.
Mm-hmm.
And often we have so much more agency in that situation: agency to walk away, agency to remain silent, agency to challenge. But we feel scared, and so we automatically recoil because we assume we've lost everything. And actually just pausing and just breathing in that moment and saying, I'm just going to take a moment before I respond. And actually, before I respond, let me just repeat back to you what I've heard you say. And so often you repeat what you think you've heard, and they say almost, or not quite, or that isn't what I meant. Let me try again. And so you've also disrupted the miscommunication and understood what it is that's leading to making this conversation unproductive in the first place.
Yeah, because I think listening skills are so important because everybody filters everything as a human being. You filter everything you see, everything you hear, everything you even smell. Like it's filtered to what your brain thinks it should be,
Right.
not what it actually maybe is.
Right.
So going and asking that question again, or asking somebody to phrase it again to see did you actually put your filter on it and not really hear it? And so a lot of times, like I think the conflict comes from people using their filter and not really and just immediately getting a trigger because their brain just put it to like, oh, this is something I don't like. This is something I'm going to get angry about. This is something I don't understand, or they just assume it's X when it's
Right.
really Y or Z or something else.
Right. That's exactly right.
So that's important. Like in your job, the listening skill and the reframing and just maybe try to tap it down so people don't go from 0 to 100 and maybe kind of breathe. I'm a creative. I'm a musician. A lot of times we have to kind of get rid of all the overload of things coming in so I can focus on the moment of creation. And if I've got like my cell phone going off and the phone and all these other things, they got to be in a space where there's not all these triggers so I
Right.
can actually be in my art.
Right.
And if you're an artist, we find that, but other people maybe if in this world it gets so overloaded, they don't know how to find that space.
Yeah. And recalibrating your nervous system. It's why conductors take that last pause before they, first of all, they bowed. I watched this the other day, and then they step back and they step on the podium. They turn and they face the orchestra. Long exhale, another pause, and then they raise their arms, and then we go. And if we as humans exercise that discipline before, even just switching from thing to thing to thing, we don't give ourselves enough capacity or space to do that effectively. And actually that mindfulness about a brilliant way to start a mediation is with breath work for all the participants, but they might think you're a bit of a loon. So just creating space for, we're not rushing into this. How are you feeling? Let's just do a bit of a check-in. Have you ever been through a process like this before? How easy did you find it getting here today? Is there anything that you're unsure about that you'd like to raise here? How is there anything that I need to be aware of in terms of reasonable adjustments or accessibility or something that you haven't yet had a chance to share with me, to just build that initial rapport? And again, part of that is the nervous system and centering that so that you're not inadvertently triggering somebody with every question because you don't know what's going on for them.
Yeah, because the anxiety kind of goes on. It's like if you have a situation that's just going to increase somebody's anxiety, then you're not going to get a good result. If you can kind of get that, breath work or just slowing down, and not being like going right 0 to 100 is always the problem. I have people trying to be like 100, too perfect. Like a lot of what I deal with in music is like happy accidents. And what I run into people is like trying to be the perfection trap of doing 100 takes when really take 4 was actually the right one.
Right.
So you go and do another 96 and you actually get yourself to like a frenzy and you actually destroyed your work because the fourth take was actually it.
I'm going to let you into a secret. I feel like that about my signature. On like Adobe sign. Like, I'll just do it again. It was fine. Why didn't I just say it was fine?
But I want to thank you for being here today. The hour always goes by quicker than we ever imagined. And we've got your Instagram and we've got your website here. So people click on which one do you want? We have both of them, but
definitely Instagram. Definitely go to
Instagram.
Instagram. Yeah, you can get to the website from Instagram.
Okay, great. So people can be able to click on both of those in the podcast description. We've been live on YouTube, Twitch, and Kick. And we'll be on all the platforms that you can listen to or watch a podcast by tomorrow, like Apple, iHeartRadio, Amazon, places like that, on Spotify video podcast. But I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've absolutely enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.